We often talk a lot about empathy and the importance of empathy in compassion, and empathy being able to really see that somebody is just like us and wanting happiness and not wanting suffering. So I came across this article in the New York Times a few months ago called "Empathy May Be Overrated in an Election and in a Leader." Yeah, so it's quite interesting. It has, and it shows the importance of having equanimity in before you have empathy. Yeah. So let me read what he says. Okay. So is empathy an essential virtue for a presidential candidate? It's by John Tierney. That's the guy who wrote it. The conventional wisdom is that a good candidate must be able to feel your pain. Bill Clinton was hailed by pundits as a virtuoso of empathy, supposedly riding that quality to triumph over George H.W. Bush, who was so often said to be short of empathy that he felt compelled to tell an audience, "Message, I care." Al Gore's defeat in 2000 was blamed in part on his emotional frigidity, and Mitt Romney's in 2012 on an empathy gap with Barack Obama. But there are a couple of problems with the conventional wisdom. To begin with, it's not clear that empathy actually matters much to voters. Okay. In the Republican primaries, Donald Trump, who brags that he's so rich he feels no pain at all, has trounced Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who empathized his family's financial struggles, and Governor John Kasich of Ohio, known for comforting rally attendees with hugs. Some political scientists say that empathy is not a crucial factor in presidential races, noting that personality qualities don't correlate well with the results on election day. A candidate often wins despite an opponent who receives higher marks in polls, asking how much each cares about the needs and problems of people like you. Of course, we're being told in this election that's what is drawing all these people, is candidates empathizing with their problems. But this guy has a very different view. The voters' indifference could reflect another problem with conventional wisdom. Empathy may not be such a great quality in a leader. Although the capacity to sympathize with others' suffering is widely hailed as an essential virtue, Mr. Obama has said the world is suffering from an empathy deficit. There is a downside that has inspired a lively debate among social psychologists. The most prominent critic is Paul Bloom, a professor of psychology at Yale, who gave a talk this year, blah, blah. He readily acknowledges that empathy can inspire altruism, that once you broaden your ambit, maybe gambit? Is ambit a word? Once you broaden your field of concern and empathize with the plight of others, in Mr. Obama's words, it becomes harder not to act, harder not to help. So this is what we know from practice. But whom do you end up helping? Often the wrong people. Dr. Bloom says because empathy is biased and parochial. It favors vulnerable children and animals and discriminates against unattractive people. That's true. You're more likely to sympathize with someone in your own social group rather than an outsider. Haven't we seen that? Especially one who looks different. Empathy is also innumerate, Dr. Bloom notes, which is why you may care more about one girl stuck in a well than thousands of war refugees or millions of people who will be affected by climate change. That's also true. Moreover, empathy can be manipulated to inspire aggression. In one experiment, when people were induced to empathize with the personal problems of one player in a game, they became more willing to punish the player's opponent, even though the opponent had nothing to do with those personal problems. Okay. In his current research, Dr. Bloom and a colleague are finding that the more empathetic people feel towards victims of terrorism in the Middle East, the more they favor taking military action. Yeah, you empathize with these people who are suffering, so let's go bomb all their opponents who are making them suffer. And that's why there's all these diplomats who sent a message to the president recently encouraging him to take stronger military action against Assad. Okay. If I want to do terrible things to a group, one tried and true way is to arouse empathy for victims of that group. Dr. Bloom said in an interview, often the argument for war is rooted in empathy for victims of the enemy. Yeah. He concludes that empathy is overrated as a guide for personal morality or practical leadership. Sob stories are not a good way to make public policy, he said. The best leaders have a certain enlightened aloofness. So here he didn't say just aloofness, it's enlightened aloofness. They recognize the suffering of victims of terrorists, but they also recognize that going to war will create future victims. They make policy by taking into account numbers and the cost-benefit analyses. They use rational means to achieve good ends. So rather than just being so empathetic and emotional that, okay, we've got to stop this immediately, so let's just send all of our planes there to, stop the enemy who's traumatizing all these people. A good leader really stops and thinks. They have empathy, but they stop and think, what's really going to solve the problem? Okay. Other researchers, though, argue that empathy isn't as irrational as it seems. Well, why would empathy, I can see how some people would think empathy is irrational. You just see one person who's suffering, like this thing, one person versus a million people. We empathize so much with the one person. Then you get all emotional, and then it's like, I have to do something right now, but you're not thinking very clearly about what to do. So that's a very emotional kind of empathy, a wrong kind of emotional, okay? But I think what he's getting at here is an empathy based on reason. Yeah, he doesn't, well, I'll read what he says and then I'll comment on it, okay? They see empathy as not just a knee-jerk reflex, but as something we can control. Our empathy declines as the number of victims increases, an effect called compassion collapse. But maybe that's because we realize we can't do anything meaningful to help the larger group. Okay? So he's taking it, we don't have empathy for a large number of people because we feel defeated before we begin, because we see that we really can't do a whole lot to affect the situation, so we insulate ourselves from the pain of seeing them. Okay? I want to backtrack to what I was mentioning a minute ago. Cultivating empathy based on reason and based on equanimity is when you see everybody wants happiness and wants to be free of suffering as intensely as I do, then you're rooting it in your own experience and using reason to see that there actually is no difference between ourselves and others. It just happens to be what we label I and what we label other. But in fact, from the viewpoint of the person who's experiencing it, everybody wants happiness and nobody wants suffering. So if we can think in that way, and have empathy based on that, it's not very emotional. In emotional in a bad way. It's emotional, yes, in that empathy is a good emotion, but it's not fluctuating and erratic, okay? Also, we have to look when we're developing empathy, and because we're basing it on equanimity, look beyond one person and see and look beyond the category all sentient beings and see all sentient beings as nothing more than a collection of individuals. Because if we say, all the people who are starving in Darfur, I have empathy for them, all the people is one big abstract thing, and it's easy to lose our empathy. It's because there's no face on it. Whereas if you see faces of particular people in that group, and then you imagine all the other faces of all the other people in that group, then it is no longer an abstract group. It is a collection of individuals, and you can really feel the individual wanting happiness and not suffering, okay? But we have to stop and think about this and create it in our own mind in a reasonable way. You getting what I'm saying? Not just, and for the benefit of all sentient beings, which we often wind up saying, But to really think all sentient beings, includes this person and that bug and that shark and that, thing at the bottom of the ocean and, aliens in other universes and politicians and everybody, You have to put a face on it, okay? So he continues, empathy can often be costly, entailing outlay of material resources, emotional effort, and physical risk, said another psychologist. If people recognize these costs, either consciously or not, they may strategically regulate their empathy away to avoid the costs. Okay, so that's another that we may empathize for a while, but then when we see that we may have to sacrifice something, for our empathy, then, or sacrifice something for our compassion, then all of a sudden our empathy, our compassion go this way. Because of course we come first. To test this theory of motivated compassion, these psychologists compared people's reactions to stories about children suffering in Darfur. This is very interesting. When people didn't expect to be asked for a donation, they responded more strongly to a story about a group of children than to a story about a single child. But if they expected to be hit up for a donation, then their compassion for the larger group collapsed, apparently because they'd regulated their empathy to protect themselves. In other words, feeling I can give to help one individual, that won't require so much. But if I'm going to help a group, then I have to be the savior that does everything, and I don't have that kind of money to give. Instead of seeing I can, it's a group of people, I can't do everything, but I can give something and know that other people will also join in. Okay? So I think sometimes what they call empathy or compassion collapse or whatever, is because we think we have to be the savior. And so we often discourage ourselves before we even start. Because how can I fix the entire problem? And I think this is one thing that activists very often suffer from, is they want to fix the entire problem completely, immediately. And that kind of attitude is a setup for quitting. Because there's no way one of us can do everything, because every effort depends on a number of people. It's not just one person, it's a number of people. And every long-term change that we want to have happens in increments, very, very slowly. Yeah, but we get fired up. We want to be the one with all our energy to change it immediately and change it completely. And when we see we can't do that, then we just quit. Yeah, instead of seeing, hey, there's, the world needs many bodhisattvas. Yeah, it needs many people with empathy and compassion. Yeah, we need to work together, and we need to have moderate expectations. Yeah. In other experiments, psychologists at Stanford have found that people can increase their empathy too. When nudged to belief that they can increase their empathy, they become more sympathetic towards people with different backgrounds and beliefs. So that's what the Dharma's doing, is nudging us to become more empathetic and sympathetic. This type of empathy doesn't always come naturally, says one of the psychologists. It's work. But choosing empathy affords us opportunities to build more diverse and powerful social connections and take control of our emotional lives. And that's very, very true. Yeah, Venerable, you sent me an article to read about when an Orthodox Jewish congregation visits a gay bar, and it was fantastic, because you saw these people started out with the right kind of empathy that was able to take them into an environment that they were totally unfamiliar with. Yeah, and to bond with the people there. Dr. Bloom, the empathy critic, agrees that this emotion can be goosed to some degree. But he says we are still better off relying on the less emotional strategy described in 1759 by Adam Smith in The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Maybe it was... Maybe it was, maybe it was moral sentiment. So we all know who Adam Smith is, the founder of strident capitalism. Smith noted that fellow feeling, his term for empathy, was a powerful yet limited emotion. An Englishman, that already tells us something. Yeah. He suggested, an Englishman, he suggested, would lose more sleep. No, it doesn't mean he's an Englishman. Although, was he? He was? Okay. So he...
No, I think it was Scottish, actually.
Yeah.
It was either English or
Scottish, okay. So an Englishman, he suggested, would lose more sleep worrying about the loss of a finger than about the deaths of 100 million foreigners in an earthquake. Yeah. So, that's when people haven't been taught how to cultivate empathy, And of course, it's my finger, rather than 100 million lives. So it's clearly the self-centeredness there. How, Smith asks, could this selfish impulse be overridden? It is not that feeble spark of benevolence with which nature has lighted up in the human heart that is thus capable of counteracting the strongest impulses of self-love, Smith wrote. It is a stronger power, a more forcible motive, which exerts itself upon such occasions. It is reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitant of the breast, the person within, the great judge and the arbiter of our conduct. So, in other words, our own sense of personal integrity. You know, he's saying that is what helps us have empathy. But it needs to be more than our own sense of personal integrity. We need to really feel the suffering of others. Yeah, and realize that everybody's totally equal, so that there's no sense playing favorites, because it's playing favorites that leads us to the quick decisions on how to, intervene in a crisis and leads to unskillful actions. That may sound like an overly optimistic view of human nature, especially this election year. Reason hardly seems to be the arbiter of a presidential candidate's conduct these days. Yeah. Well, some are more reasonable, others are more unreasonable. But voters may ultimately prefer it to empathy. But I don't see reason and empathy as contradictory, like this guy does. Yeah, I think they go very well together. Yeah, and it's when empathy doesn't have reason behind it that then you get all sorts of problems. Yeah.
Work taught us a pretty important distinction between empathy and sympathy.
Mm-hmm.
And I heard this being used
Interchangeably here, yeah.
And I think you're right. Like, empathy has a lot of reason. Like, we were taught sympathy is actually a negative.
Mm.
Empathy is the positive. That empathy empowers, sympathy diminishes.
Mm-hmm.
Sympathy is just listening and kind of having that reason kind of behind it. Where sympathy is like, dude, I'm gonna like make you
Yeah.
solve all your problems for you. And I feel bad, but I'm gonna solve it for you.
Yeah. So, that these words they're very confusing because empathy and sympathy sometimes seem to be the same thing. You're defining them as very differently. Sympathy being this gushy, I sympathize, I'm going to fix all your problems for you thing, whereas empathy is not like that. I don't know. I mean, they're very confusing words how we use them in public discourse. So I think when we use them, it's probably good that we define what we're referring to.
I hear a lot of politicians with sympathy, but not empathy.
Empathy, yeah. Yeah.
I have two things. Which one of your teachers was the one who was walking along the shore and throwing these crabs back into the water?
Oh, no, he was the one putting his mala in the sea anemones' mouths.
Maybe it's something I read, but to me, the whole time I'm listening to that, I'm thinking of that thing that we learned when we did the retreat here for the compassion, activism with altruism.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we always were talking about compassion, and so we always were focused on the other. And I see the point of having the empathy so that you're feeling it, but it seems like it's safer to train in compassion so that you know when you've lost the object being the other rather than going into personal distress.
Mm-hmm.
And then that was the one thing that I just felt like there was this, it wasn't ever clear to me like how that was defined there, like what was the empathy meaning? You were feeling their pain, or were you having your own experience of their pain so that you could, I don't know, it just seemed like compassion seemed safer.
Yeah. I think this is another thing that, is depending on how we use the words and what we mean by them. The way I'm thinking of it is like empathy comes before compassion. Yeah. Empathy means you kind of, you feel you're aware of somebody else's suffering and you care about it, or you care, you're aware of their suffering and it moves you. But then compassion is wanting them to be free of that suffering.
So I kind of if I was engaging in somebody with this on any kind of basis, I would try to move it towards compassion, because the whole way that thing happens, it'd be so easy, as they describe so well, to fall into this feeling of personal distress.
Mm-hmm.
Also that thing of where they talked about the collapse. I think that story really helped me, of the Geshe or somebody who's walking along the beach, and he was throwing, and the tide had gone out, and there were all these beings there that were going to have trouble, so there were tons of them, like thousands, and he was just pitching them back in the water, and the person said, "You can never get all of these, why are you doing this?" And he said, "Well, it matters a lot to the ones that I do."
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that whole attitude is what I try to call up when these things feel too big.
Yeah.
Which is what happens here. I can see why you would collapse, like I can't do anything. But then, once again, you've gone from caring for the others to your own personal distress.
Right.
Recognize that.
Yeah. Yeah. And that can happen, I think, with either empathy or compassion. Yeah. That it seems so big. And I think the real problem is, I'm the savior.
I have to do something. And if I can't, this is the thing about you can't be effective.
You can't be effective unless you cure everything entirely, immediately, by yourself, single-handedly.
And that is now on your side. You've lost sight
Of what's happening with them. Yeah. Yeah. We're extremists, aren't we?
I mean, I've seen my mind do that too.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh-huh.
In Ethics for the New Millennium, His Holiness really outlines very clearly how he goes from empathy to compassion. It's worth looking at again.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting how he does it.
Do you want to pull that out?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah.
But what I was thinking, in addition to that, coming at it from the Buddhist perspective, though, we also have the idea of, our bodhisattva ideal as an example, and so our increasing capacity is like, limitless.
Yeah.
If you don't have that, if you don't have the idea that we have the capacity to continue to grow our compassion infinitely over a long period of time, then very easy to let that collapse, I think.
Yeah.
So it helps us.
So having the idea that our compassion, our empathy and our compassion can grow limitlessly, and that we can develop more and more skills in the future, that helps us stay focused on, or what I call, you stay focused on the long-term goal. And you're content to do what you're doing according to your current capability, knowing that you can improve, and you're focused on where you're going, not with this thing of I've got to get there tomorrow, but this is a long-term path. So that helps you maintain your empathy and your compassion long-term.
First part of the article was reminding me of a worldview that Venerable Tarpa had given me a long time ago about the drama triangle, where
Yeah.
there's a victim, and then someone steps in to become the savior, and then you
Have the perpetrator.
have a perpetrator
Yeah.
who was victimizing, but that those roles just keep shifting over time. Get into that dynamic.
Yeah, that's a very good point. When you have that dynamic of perpetrator, victim, and savior, yeah, the savior steps in to, help the victim against the perpetrator, but then the savior loses all perspective and gets completely involved, and sometimes becomes the perpetrator of harm. Maybe against the former perpetrator, or sometimes even against the victim themselves. And so these positions keep changing. So this is what happens when we have a good emotion that gets corrupted by afflictions. So that's why, when they talk about the four immeasurables, love, compassion, joy, and equanimity, they always talk about the near enemy. Yeah, the mental state that seems to be like this one, but isn't really it. Okay, so attachment is the near enemy of love. Okay, being Mr. or Miss Fix-It is the near enemy of compassion. You know, near enemy of joy, I think, would be exuberance or micromanaging somebody else's life. Yeah, but also, yeah, exuberance. And the near enemy of equanimity would be apathy. Yeah. So we always, whenever we talk about these, we have to define them and we have to separate them out from the corrupt versions or the near enemies.
I just see the wisdom in some of these organizations that are valid ones, where they connect more affluent people with like one child in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
Sponsor one child or one family, rather than putting out the news, guess what, there's 900 million people in Africa that are needing your help.
Yeah.
Then, one person at a time.
Yeah. So, yeah, this is a very big fundraising strategy. You connect, the donors with one particular individual. And I can see the benefit in that. But I can also see the disadvantage, because that has happened in the case of Tibetans looking for sponsors for the different monks and nuns. So the very cute little monks have 3 or 4 sponsors. The older monks don't have any. And the way the monasteries have it is the sponsorship goes to the individual. That creates inequality, which does not function well in a community. The way Tibetan Nuns Project did it is each donor can write to a specific nun, but all the donations are shared by the entire community, so everybody is equal. And I think that is much better. Yeah, you can link with one person, so you have a face to your compassion, but it's not favoritism. Yeah, and it's not it doesn't get corrupted.